So, this webinar is on embedded exploitation for IoT devices, and it's a kind of a short 60 minutes packed session into how you can get started with embedded hacking and how you can explore different devices. And if you have never performed any kind of embedded hacking or exploitation in the past, this session will also get you started with what are the different things that you need to do, how to look at embedded devices, how do you explore it, what are the different attack types, what tools needs to be used, and also later on we'll look at how can you further perform more exploitation and more learning all by yourself. So it's going to be a lot of material, it's going to be a lot of content. A copy of this presentation will also be shared afterwards. In the meanwhile, if you have any questions or if you are confused about any of the things, or if you'd like to answer specific questions, we can also take that at the end of the session. So let's get started. So when we talk of embedded devices, if you have never worked with embedded devices, this is the kind of image that typically pops in your mind, where you have these kind of scary or complex looking circuits which have different uh, layout which you might be unfamiliar with in the very start. So let's begin by looking at what exactly are these devices, and is it really this complex to get started in embedded hacking? So, embedded devices, when we say the term embedded devices, we are generally referring to a device that has some sort of computational power inside it. So, it could be a very small amount of computational power, it could be a large, so it could be, let's say, a basic, very small device like a buzzer, or it could be something like a smart home system, it could be an industrial control device, it could be an infotainment system of an automobile, or something that's used in aviation. So all these different kind of devices which have different kind of computational power inside it is what we are referring to as embedded devices. And we are specifically focusing on embedded devices for IoT. It consists of a number of different moving parts. So you have the actual devices itself, which is what we refer to as embedded devices in this case. But then it also has other elements like networking, radio, you have mobile application, and all those other things. So the topic of this presentation is only limited to the embedded section of IoT devices. And that's also the idea of what we want you to achieve after this presentation, is so that you can look at any hardware device and be able to understand what this device does. And you should be able to look at the circuit board, understand what are the different components, what are the chips, their functionalities, how they work, and possibly come up with different attack vectors or different kind of execution strategies that will help you exploit that device. So, before starting any embedded pen testing or any embedded security research, one of the first things that needs to be understood is what are the goals with embedded exploitation. Now, depending on which device you're performing it on, or depending on what is the situation, the goals would actually vary in terms of embedded device exploitation. So, the goal of an embedded exploitation is not just to exploit the device, but it could also be, because we are talking in the context of IoT devices, it could also be to learn more information about the device, to look at how the device functions, to understand its mechanics, because hardware often holds the secrets and initial points of research for IoT. So it will give you a lot of information of how the device functions, different components that you'll find in the mobile application or the firmware. You would be able to get it. You would be able to get more information about it in the hardware. So that's why also a lot of pen testers and security researchers prefer to start with hardware pen testing and then proceed to other aspects of IoT pen testing, because oftentimes it's very easy to just open a device and then look at what's inside and then have that information as you proceed along with the entire pen testing journey. So over the next 50 minutes or so, we'll be looking at how you can get started and the different step by step. But we'll be going in a sort of non-linear way. So we'll be talking about different kind of exploitation techniques, different kind of scenarios, and that will also encapsulate within it what are the tools that can be used, what are the different underlying mechanisms of protocols, or how does a protocol function, and things like that. So embedded devices is slowly increasing in complexity, as you'd probably be noticing if you're already performing some research in embedded devices, is that these days you have all different kind of complex embedded devices. So you also have a lot of devices which are used in, let's say, smart factories, where you have all these computations that are done on the embedded device itself. And recently, vendors have also started adding more and more of security protections, be it in terms of how the data is stored on the device, as well as things such as tamper resistance and protection against various hardware security vulnerabilities. So we'll be also looking at some of those. So we start the embedded exploitation journey by performing a recon on the device. And by recon, we want to obtain as much information about the device as possible. So if you look at this device that we have, let's say the Bosch smart home camera or smart indoor camera, this is how the device looks. And the first level of recon that you do is just by looking at the device and looking at it from a visual exterior perspective. So look at what are the different components, what are the different ports of entry. So it could have maybe a SD card slot, it could have a USB slot where you can plug in external peripherals, and that could lead to some interesting scenarios. Or you can also look at the labels that are present on the chip or labels that are present on the device. Typically, it's on the back or somewhere hidden so that it's not visible in the normal view of the device. And on that label, because it's an IoT device, and if it's being sold in the United States, it will have something called as FCC ID. FCC simply stands for Federal Communication Commission, and it's a certification standard that devices need to go through if they have any sort of radio communication or radio transmission, and the device is going to be sold in the States. And in here, you can search for any device's FCC ID, and you can look at all the information that it has. So some of the information that you can see in the FCC ID is external photos, internal photos, user manual, and these kind of things. So if you look at external photos, here's the Bosch Smart IP camera. And you can look at the fact that it has certain slots, it has certain USB slots. This is just the external analysis, and this is very easily accessible just by going to fccid.io and then searching for that FCC ID. Now, apart from just the external pictures, you can also look at the internal pictures of the device. So even before opening the device, you can look at how does the device looks from inside. How does the circuit looks like? What are some of the possible chips on the device, and so on. So you can get all of this information from the FCC ID number itself. And once you have detailed, high quality picture of the internals, you can look up the information about the chip. So you can read the label from the chip and then find more information about it. So that's the first step, which is recon, where you look at the FCC ID of the device, you look at the external of the device, and you try to find as much information as possible about the device. And that is something that will assist you in the further steps. This is another device, Google Home. And you can even go to FCC ID and search for just a company, and you can see all the devices that they have. And oftentimes, it will also have devices that are not yet launched to the public market. So this is also a good piece of research if you're into looking at what a particular company is up to. If we look at, let's say, this one, so this is a wireless streaming device. And you have all the internal and external pictures. There's also a way you can do it, which one of the attendees, Sina, has shared. There's also a Discord channel that I'll talk about at the end. And that's where we can share this kind of information so that everyone can see and use it. So this is how you get started with FCC ID. Now, occasionally what vendors do is some of the sensitive information like schematics, which is actual diagram of how the different components are laid together. The normal way is to have a confidentiality request for that so that it's not available on the FCC ID website. But occasionally, some vendors fail to do it, or maybe it's a issue on the FCC's part. But occasionally, you'll also find things like schematics available on the FCC ID database. So even though the file name says confidential, it wasn't made confidential when all of this information was put online. And here you have the full schematics. And the reason why this is confidential, if you're not sure, so with the schematics, anyone can build a similar device or anyone can know the exact working of how the device functions down to the very individual electronic components. And this is a big part of the intellectual property of an embedded device. So this is something that you can also look at into how to understand schematics, how to create your own devices by building schematics if you're into creating your own hardware or digging deep into hardware at this level. Now, another thing that goes along with Recon is this concept of attack surface mapping. So often what I do is between Recon and attack surface mapping, as well as when I find new information, I just keep adding to the attack surface map diagram that I have created for the embedded device. And that gives immediate visibility into the kind of target that you're after and the kind of approaches that you can take, and makes you just more effective when it comes to exploiting an embedded device, especially when you're in a limited time frame, when there's a very short window where you have to perform the pen test of a device. And if you're not familiar with attack surface mapping, as the name suggests, the initial idea is to map the possible attack surface of a particular component. So it could be done for an entire IoT device, or it could be done for a specific section, which is the embedded device itself. What looks like a black box initially, what is something that we have no idea about. So we kind of start filling in the different pieces that are present for that particular device or for that particular component. And once we have the different pieces, or once we have the different assets of a particular scenario, then we look at how these different components interact with each other. So how does the flash chip or how does the SoC interact with each other if you're talking in terms of embedded exploitation? And whenever we look at attack surface mapping, initially you might not have a lot of idea about how to go after it. So the way you can do it just by listing down all the different components that you have, and then as you go along, you start filling in the different pieces. And if you look at an IoT device, so the IoT device has a PCB inside it where you have different components such as the chips, interfaces, tracks, and vias. And this is how a particular PCB might look like. So you have the chip on the circuit, and you have tracks that connect different components on the circuit. And then you also have the pads, which are the circular uh, golden things that you see over here. So it could be something like a pad, or it could be an exposed pin header that provides further access. And then you also have something called as vias, which connects two different layers or two different points across the layers of a PCB. And each of the chip that you'll encounter will have pins along with the chip. And each of the pin is programmed for a different functionality. Let's say if you're talking about a flash chip, which is the chip that stores data for an embedded device, in that we'll have one particular pin for data out, one particular pin for data in, one pin for clock, and so on. One of the things that you can do is you can look at the data sheet of a chip and then find out what are the different pins meant for. And once you have that information, then you can interact with the chip based on the communication that it expects. So that is how a chip looks like. And all the chips that you'll encounter, they'll be connected to different other components on the circuit, and they're usually connected by with different tracks. And these tracks just act as a way of connection between two different components. And occasionally, let's say one of the security protections that some vendors do is they slightly cut off the track if they have to break, let's say, the JTAG connection. So by looking at the JTAG pin for the SoC and where it's going, what is the exposed endpoint, and if you see that there's a track that's cut, that means that the vendor is trying to disable JTAG connection. And you could simply put a solder bridge there, which would reestablish the connection. and that would give you access to the JTAG interface. So understanding chips and understanding tracks is one of the very core aspects of how we perform embedded exploitation. And based on this information, like we're talking about for attack surface mapping, if we note down the different chips that we have, so one of the main chips that we have in any embedded device is the system on chip. And that is kind of the most important chip on an IoT device. So let's say the system on chip is connected to a flash chip, which is MXIC25L12835F, and that's the part number for the flash chip. And it could also be connected to other chips. Now, based on the part number of this chip, in this case, this is MXIC, this particular number, we initially would not be knowing that this is a flash chip. So what you could do is simply read the label from the top and go to Google and search for the data sheet. And here you have the data sheet that tells you more information about the chip. And if you scroll down, we can see that this chip is for flash data storage. It works over SPI communication protocol. This is the voltage, chip frequency, and all this additional information. You would also have what is called as a pin configuration. And this is how the chip actually looks like. So these are the different legs that you have, and the dot indicates so that even if the chip is rotated and then placed on the circuit, you still would be able to find out what is the number 1, 2, 3, and 4 in the proper order. And once you have this particular chip layout, then you can start interacting with the chip in different ways. So this is one of the things that is that needs to be done whenever you start performing an embedded exploitation, is to identify the chips, the functionalities, and that can be done by locating the data sheet and then going through it. And based on that, you can then form additional diagrams into how that device actually works. So the SoC, let's say, has an exposed UART endpoint. So UART is one of the interfaces that we'll see very shortly, and it gives you access to devices, root console, boot up logs, and these kind of things. So let's say we have a UART interface that's coming from the SoC, and when we connect to the UART interface, it asks for an authentication. So it asks for a login and password. Now, one way of obtaining the authentication credential or obtaining any kind of data that is stored on the device is using this element of flash chip. So flash chip is what holds data. And because we know the pinout, we can interact with the flash chip and read all the data from it, which is what will be the firmware. Oftentimes, it could also be other kind of data storage. But if we are able to read from the flash chip, here we are getting the firmware. And if we extract the firmware, it will contain the file system. And one of the binaries in the file system is a binary called login, reverse engineering which we get the authentication credentials. And using that credentials, we log in and we change a particular feature in the bootloader or in the running device itself called security mode. And as soon as this is changed, it transmits it to the mobile application through BLE, which then sends additional information to the remote endpoint. So this is how a sample attack surface map looks like. It's a sample attack surface map so that you get an idea of how you can build your own and how you can design one for any kind of security research that you do. And as time passes, as you perform more and more security research, you'd start seeing a lot of patterns that would help you identify which element or which component to go after, which has the highest chances of success. That's something that I'd highly recommend before you start any pen test. Start with the attack surface map and then proceed with that. Now, looking at how to gain access to the hardware, which is how do you get access to all of these different chips or the PCB that we are talking about. So different devices are built in different ways. So even if we are interested in the PCB, the outer casing or the outer shield might be put together either through, let's say, a glue, or it could be welded together, or there could be screws that hold it in place. So your goal as a hardware hacker or an embedded exploiter is to look at how that particular device is put together and then use appropriate hardware tools to open up the device. And whenever you perform hardware exploitation, I would also very much recommend that you always have a two or more set of devices, because if you're opening up the device, there could be a possibility that the device has some sort of security in place, which might erase the flash if it's a very uh, secure device, which might erase the flash as soon as you open the device. So these kind of things is something that you should be taking care of as well. So tear down is simply how you take apart a device, look at how it's put together, look at where screws could be placed, let's say inside or under the label, under the rubber feet, hidden places that you have on the device. And have a good set of screwdriver. iFixit has a good one. Tools to take apart any surfaces that are put together. So something like a hot air gun is also very useful. You can also have tweezers. Then you have the ESD mat, which is recommended whenever you perform any kind of hardware security stuff or working or interacting with hardware. And once you have exposed the device or opened up the device, then to properly look at it, because it in some cases it could be very tiny. So it's better to have a USB microscope. And the tear down toolkit that you have is something that will build over time. But having a good set of screwdriver, which will allow you to take it apart, is something that you can start with. So this is tear down of Samsung QLED TV, the remote of that particular TV. So you can see that this is how it's held together. If you open it up, you have the circuit over here. And this is what we're interested in from an embedded exploitation perspective. And occasionally, you would also have some kind of security screws where the middle hole might not be present. So the normal screwdrivers won't work. So in these cases, you might have to get special set of screwdrivers which work with these kind of pieces of screws. And once you open the device, this is what you'll encounter, the bare PCB of the device, which has certain chips, which has tracks going between different components. If you want to go into invasive attacks, or if you want to take apart chips from the PCB, there's also many different ways to do it. But primarily, we are concerned with the non-invasive ways of doing it in this particular session. But in some cases, it might actually need you to take apart that flash chip and then have a custom adapter for it, or have a custom setup where you can interact with that particular chip. And this is another PCB image of the Oculus Rift. And oftentimes, when you see these kind of PCBs, when you're opening a device, these are the things that we want to also pay attention to, which are the interfaces and things such as the pads or pins. So these over here, so you have these test points or TP, and then you have some more over here, and so on. Similarly, this is a tear down of the Oculus Quest headset. So you have the chips over here, and then you also have different kind of connectors and so on. So once you have this bare PCB with you, the next step is to look at how these different elements are communicating with each other. So if you look at a PCB, you might have two different chips which are interacting with each other, and the transmission from data from one chip to the other is done in different ways for different communication protocols. So if it's UART, it's done in a different way. If it's SPI, the data packets will be different, and so on. So identifying what is the protocol of a chip will help you understand what is the data pattern or the packet structure that you expect to see. And that will help you understand how the chip communicates. And once we are looking at this layer, there are different aspects of it that we can focus on. So either we can focus on the chip, so either we can interact with the chip, we can explore the chip in as much depth as possible, or we can explore the communication between the chips, which is what you can possibly do with something like a logic sniffer, which allows you to look at the data that is being transmitted from a particular chip or received on a particular chip. So either you can focus on the chip, or you can focus on the communication, or you can focus on some other elements such as the sound that is generated from that particular interaction, or how much time a particular processing takes, and how much power is consumed. And looking very minutely at these kind of things will allow you to research into aspects such as side channel attacks and glitching based attacks. And that might require a lot more complex equipment. And if you're into side channel attacks and glitching based attacks, then there's a new book called the Hardware Hacking Handbook, and that's something that you can explore by yourself. So once we know that these are the different chips, this is how they communicate, then let's look at how can we actually exploit or look at some of the ways in which we can attack the chip or attack the entire embedded device so that we get some insights or we get access to the device. So depending on what kind of access we want on the device, there are different ways in which we can proceed. So if we want a root shell, the very usual or common go-to way is by getting access to UART interface. And UART is a protocol that through which chips can communicate with each other. So if you gain access to UART of a device, you can possibly get access to the root shell and have a direct access to the device. In some cases, there might also be authentication in these hardware serial interfaces. And that's something that we can also look at by looking at what is stored in other chips or what is stored in the data storage chips. And data storage chips can use different kind of communication protocols. Most common is SPI, but you also have NAND flash chips, I2C, and so on. So whatever communication protocol a data storage chip or a flash chip is using, based on that, you can interact with the chip and then obtain information like the firmware, secrets, or keys, or authentication credentials, which you can then use at different places, maybe in the UART authentication as well. Another thing that we might want to do in embedded devices is to be able to see all the different processes that are running and be able to modify the processes in real time. And this is something that can be done with JTAG, which is a very powerful way of interacting and communicating with a device. And you can use it in many different ways. You can use it to perform runtime manipulation. You can also use it to perform exploitation and fuzzing, or simply to look at how a device is behaving. So these are some of the things that we discuss in the exploitation types. We'll go further into it. So we have UART, which is serial console access. We have chip access, which is reading and writing from a chip using protocols such as SPI or I2C. Then we have debugging protocols or debugging standards like JTAG and SWD. Other kind of attacks that you can also explore is communication sniffing, which is done through logic sniffer, communication spoofing, and tampering. And these can be done at many different layers. So you can either perform it in between chips, or you can either perform it at the level of FPGA, where some of the attacks like row hammer and all work. And then you also have glitching based attacks, so causing different kind of faults and glitches in the embedded device and using it in some way to gain access to certain parts of the embedded device is what can be achieved with glitching based attacks. And then you have side channel attacks where you have things like power, sound, and time based analysis and very minutely observing those data and causing changes in it to figure out what's going on and to recover things like RSA keys and all of that. And often, like if you're just getting started, I would also suggest you to use one protocol or learn about one protocol at a time, and possibly also combine two protocols, especially when it's very related to each other. So you could possibly start with UART and then move to SPI, and SPI and I2C are very much similar to each other. So you can learn both of them together. Similarly, you can do JTAG and SWD, USB and eMMC. So that just makes the learning process slightly easier because you're not jumping around from one very different protocol to another protocol. So the UART that we mentioned, if we look at some of the things that we discussed, so the UART protocol or Universal Asynchronous Receive Transmit usually has 4 different pins like you see over here. And these pins are typically transmit, receive, ground, and power. And if you look at how UART works, so 2 chips, simply one chip sends, which is transmit, and the other chip receives, which is the receive. So the transmit from one pin or the transmit from one chip goes to the receive of other chip, and the receive of the other chip goes to the transmit of this one. Additionally, the ground is connected for both of the chips. And because it's an asynchronous communication protocol, there's no concept of clock over here. So, how does it determine when a UART packet begins? Is by looking at the changes in voltage. If it's goes from high to low, that might indicate that a UART packet is beginning. And then you would have certain start bits and certain bits that would indicate that the packet is come to an end. So by voltage change, which is how zeros and ones are represented in the digital domain, so using that, you can figure out when a UART packet begins, the data length, which is typically 8, and then the final stop bits by to indicate the stop of the packet. And all of this packet identification is typically inbuilt into any of the tools that you use. So if you're using, let's say, FTDI breakout or Attify badge or JTagulator or even logic sniffer, they already have these in place, so you don't need to identify it one by one. But in cases where you're not really sure of what's going on, you can also go down to this layer and figure out what's going on. So that's about UART. And in order to interact with UART, we need to also have this thing called baud rate, which is the speed at which the data communicates or the data transmission happens. And there are some standard baud rates like 1200, 19200, 57600, and 115200. And this simply is a standard agreed upon value by both the chips so that the data exchange happens smoothly and fluently. And to interact with any device which has UART, you can either use a FTDI breakout or you could use a device such as Attify badge, which allows you to interact with UART chips. And you connect the Attify badge's TX, which is D0, to the RX of the device that you're working with, and D1, which is the RX of Attify badge, to the transmit of the device that you're working with. And that will allow you to hook the transmit and receive. And to identify which is the transmit pin, which is the receive pin, and which is the ground pin, we use a tool called multimeter. And this allows you to measure voltage at across different points in a PCB. So one of the things that you can do with the multimeter is perform this continuity test, which allows you to find out what is the ground pin out of all the different pins that you have. So here's how you can do it. So first, you set the multimeter to what looks like a buzzer icon or a speaker icon. And whenever we are measuring voltage, in this case, we want to find out ground. So we want to have a reference voltage or a reference ground, which could be any metallic shield on the device or any known ground. And then the other probe of multimeter is what will iterate over all the different pins. So we'll go through all the pins, and wherever the multimeter produces a buzz sound is what is the ground of that chip or ground of that particular UART pin combination. So when let's say this particular pin is ground, so as soon as we put the black probe over here and the red probe is already in a common reference ground, the internal circuitry of multimeter completes and there's a small buzzer inside it. So you'll hear a sound whenever the circuit is complete, and that's how you'll know that this is the ground chip or ground pin. And once you have identified the ground pin, the next step is to identify different pins, which is the TX and RX. And if there are only 3 pins, then you could also use a brute force approach. So once you have identified ground, the other 2 pins could be either TX or RX. But if you want to find it out accurately, you can look at the voltage fluctuations on the multimeter as soon as the device is booting up. So for the transmit pin, as soon as the device boots up, there would be a lot of boot up logs or boot up messages that would cause a lot of voltage fluctuation in the multimeter. And that voltage fluctuation will be very minimal when it comes to RX. And that is one way of identifying TX and RX on a UART interface. There are other ways as well, which is you could use something like a JTagulator or a logic sniffer to also immediately identify what is the TX and RX. And once you have identified the pins, you can then run a tool called baudrate.py, which will identify the baud rate, the speed of communication, and it will then jump to minicom, which is what will give you shell access. And that's the entire process of UART. So starting with pin identification, starting with the ground, then identifying TX and RX, then connecting it with a device such as Attify badge, and then running the baudrate.py, which brings you to minicom. And this is how it typically looks. So you have the system boot up logs, and then you'll also have, in most of the cases, authentication, which will give you access to the device. And there are also some additional tools that we have written, which is available on our GitHub repo. So many of the IoT devices, if you work with UART, you'd have a lot of boot up messages that might interfere with your way of working with the device. So you could use this Attify serial console to filter out for those words and execute commands over UART without being bothered by all the debug logs that keep interrupting the input and output. And to connect to the 4 pins that we discussed, like VCC, ground, TX, and RX, you could either connect it directly or you could solder your pins or wires over there and then connect to it. So soldering is also something that could be useful if you're willing to go deeper into hardware exploitation. So having a basic tool suite for soldering and then working with some test boards and learning the methodology and then soldering whenever it's needed in case of UART. It's required in some of the cases. If you're working with JTAG, then it's required in pretty much all the cases and so on. The next protocol that we can look at is SPI, and this is the protocol that you'd most often find in flash chips, which is the chips that store data. And it's also found in other chips such as chips for networking, encryption, crypto, sensors, and so on. And this is how a typical SPI flash chip would look like with 8 legs. It can have other variations as well, but this is one of the most common layouts. And in both the cases, it's a 8-pin SPI flash. And if you look at the picture of the chip, there's a dot in both of the images. And this dot indicates where is the pin 1. So when you look at the data sheet, you can refer to it with a dot, and that particular pin or that particular leg is going to be the pin number 1. And once you have identified the pins 1 to 8, then you can connect to it using these connectors such as SOIC clip, SOI clip, or mini test probes to directly hook into individual pins. And on the other end, you can have a device such as bus pirate or Attify badge, and then read data from the SPI chip or write data to the SPI chip, which is kind of writing new firmware to the device or pulling firmware from the device and or reading secrets from the device and so on. So this is the pinout that you'd find from the data sheet. Then you'll connect to it. Here we're using a SOI clip and connected to an Attify badge. And once you read the data, it will dump it to a bin file. And you can run tools like binwalk to extract the file system in case it's a firmware. Then you can extract the file system and look at all the individual files, look at the configuration, look at the binaries, look for software related security issues, logic based vulnerabilities, and so on. You can also take some of these binaries to your local system, emulate it using QEMU. If you want to perform some local exploitation or if you want to write fuzzers to identify vulnerabilities, often having it in an emulated way is more better compared to doing it directly on the device. But once you have the file system, you're free to do anything that you want. And file system comes from the firmware, which is what you obtain by connecting to the flash chip over SPI. You can also obtain firmware in some of the cases from the vendor's website, but in many of the cases, you won't have it publicly available. And also from the file system, you can do things like password cracking and use it as a way to gain access to the device over SSH and so on. So that's about SPI, and UART and SPI is very easy to approach. I don't think it requires a lot of skills as such, just a bit of practice. And once you try it on a couple of different targets, then you are ready to perform it on real world devices. The next protocol or the next thing that we are going to look at is called JTAG, or Joint Test Access Group, which is the name of a consortium that was found in 1980s or 90s by a group of European device manufacturers when the bed of nails testing approach met its peak. So originally, to check the different chips and to check the pins of the different chip, whether it's functioning properly or not, a bed of nails testing approach was used where each pin was tested individually, and it resulted in a lot of time, and it was also very expensive. So as the device density increased, as more and more chips got added to the device, there was a requirement of a better solution to test all the chips whether it's functioning well or not. And that's when JTAG was developed. So it adds these boundary scan cells at the along with each chip, and then these are connected to each other. And in JTAG, we simply send a series of zeros and ones, and we change the state of the tap controller, which will make the data go in different pathways. Or you can then look at the data that you sent in and the data that comes out, and whether the data that comes out from the pathway is the expected data or whether there's some variation in it. So that's how JTAG works behind the scenes. If you want to just interact with it, you need four different pins: TDI, TDO, TMS, and TCK, which is data in, data out, mode select, and test reset. And you connect to it using Attify batch. And once you do that, then you can use OpenOCD to debug that particular device over JTAG. And once you have JTAG access, then you can also use that JTAG access as a way to debug the device. So you can use GDB or IDA remote debugging to set breakpoints at different places, look at registers, perform different kind of exploitation, and so on. So that's about JTAG. From the hardware perspective, I think these are very much essential if you want to do anything in hardware or embedded device exploitation. If you want to take it further, you can also look into firmware exploitation, because once you have the firmware from the device, you can also modify it, repack it, and then flash it back to the device. And also in those situations, you can test the checksum verification mechanism, or how does the device handles whether firmware is legit or not. So you can look at bypassing those security protections as well. Next is glitching based attacks, and this is something that, as the name suggests, is intended to cause a glitch in a chip. It could be due to some malformed input, it could be due to voltage fluctuation or switching between different sources of voltage, modifying voltage in unpredictable ways, and seeing how the chip responds. It's a kind of shorting. So one of the voltages that you use is ground, and you connect it or short one of the IO pins with ground. And if the device is, let's say, in the booting up stage where the device is supposed to boot up kernel, and at this moment, if you cause the glitch, instead of booting the kernel, it will stay in the bootloader stage, and that will give you access to the bootloader. And in bootloader, you have more flexibility into what you can do. So you can change the boot parameters, you can point it to a different kernel address, and so on. So if you look over here, the device is booting, and as soon as you short, it drops back to the bootloader prompt. And here you can change the boot arguments. Another thing that you can work with in hardware exploitation is communication sniffing. So similar to what you do in web app exploitation is, let's say, using Burp Suite or MITM proxy to capture the traffic. You can also do the same with hardware. So you can use this tool called Logic Sniffer and capture the communication between two different chips. And this will also give you more insights about the internal packet structure of the particular protocol and how the chip is communicating. And that will also help you gain more understanding of how the device functions. And it can also help you recover keys, especially if it's a very unknown protocol that you're working with, but you know that this is where the key is stored. So you just want to sniff that particular key as soon as it's transmitted from that chip, and then you'll have it in the logic view. And they're already pre-built analyzers, so you don't have to worry about the protocols that you might be working with. So the list of analyzers that comes as a part of the logic tool is pretty vast. You can also build your own analyzers. So this is a blog post by F-Secure, where this logic analyzer approach that I just mentioned was used to extract the BitLocker key by building a custom script on top of that. Additional advanced hardware attacks is if you want to dig deep into hardware exploitation, as in core hardware exploitation. So you can look at things such as the row hammer vulnerability, which is probably one of the most popular vulnerabilities in the recent times. So the DRAM memory devices, the way it stores data is in different rows and columns. And whenever a particular column is accessed for accessing that particular memory, it leaks a small amount of energy charging the nearby cells. So if that particular memory access is coordinated in a way so that it's very frequent, like millions of times per second, it creates a lot of energy leakage, and that toggles or that flips the bit that is next to it or the neighboring bits. And this could have severe consequences, like it could give you root access, it could give you encryption keys. So one of the things that was done is the RSA cryptographic keys that was stored on VM, another VM hosted in the same cloud environment, could be accessed by exploiting something like this. And there have been many advanced versions of this. So as the vendors patched through Hammer, there were additional vulnerabilities based on the same concept like flip feng shui and blacksmith. So by modifying the access pattern of memory bits, ComSec guys were able to bypass a lot of protections that the vendor has put in. You could also go deeper and look at FPGAs and how do you reprogram FPGAs and look for vulnerabilities over there if they are not properly configured. And that's pretty much some of the key things that you can look at when you want to get started with embedded exploitation, or when you want to look at devices and figure out how do you explore it further to gain more insights and possibly shells and firmware and all these kind of information. And if you want to learn it in a structured way, there are a number of things you can do. I'd recommend you to go with an exploration mindset. So whenever you look at a device, I think it has always like fascinated me from the very start to look at how a device functions. And that particular approach, which is just to explore the device and the different components and how does this device actually function, is a very interesting learning experience. You can also contribute to open source projects if you want to be active and learning in a very, very fast way. As mentioned, take one protocol at a time if possible, and bundle or group protocols which are similar in nature to make sure that you learn SPI and then I2C and those kind of things. If you want to start with working with hardware, the best device that you can start with is Arduino. And that's a very easy, beginners friendly device that you can get started with and perform some of the exploitation techniques, as well as learn about different protocols in a very, very friendly way. So with Arduino, if you have some devices lying around in your house or office, some old routers or other embedded devices, those are also very interesting targets. And for routers, you'd find a lot of information on DDWRT and OpenWRT website, where you can look at whether a particular device has UART port, JTAG port or not. And then you can obviously move to IoT devices. And oftentimes you'd be hitting brick walls. So try to spend more time till things get solved, because a lot of things in hardware is just thinking in different ways and novel ways of figuring out how you can get to what you want to get to. And there's also a recent video by Joe Grant looking at a crypto wallet, which could be interesting if you want to look at the entire actual life process of how a hardware attack could possibly look like. And yeah, start building your lab setup gradually. Focus on the tear down, and then you can start building for different protocols. And as you progress in your hardware hacking journey, add devices, because the devices are going to be endless. It's all a matter of how precise you want to get in in one particular aspect. So a multimeter could be of $50 or $5,000 depending on your requirements. So go accordingly as you proceed. And there are also recently a lot of bug bounties that you can work with for hardware devices. And that's also a very good way to learn and practice on real world targets. If you want to go at it from a career perspective, pen testing hardware devices or pen testing IoT devices is a very, very growing field of InfoSec. And if you're just getting started, or even if you're thinking of moving into this direction, this is a great opportunity for you to start your career in that direction. If not pen testing, if you're more of a exploit research guy, there's also a lot of possibilities over there. You can also perform IoT forensics. You can build your own hardware devices or build your own hardware hacking devices. We could also see how these things converge with other technologies. Let's say if you're into machine learning, there's a recent project that looks at the PCB images and auto classifies the different chips that are present on the device and tells you more information about the chips. And all of that code is and paper is also open source. And then you also have options in the defense, which is how do you build more secure devices? If you're looking at building a very secure payment processor, a very secure medical IoT device, only when you know of how these devices can be compromised, you can try to safeguard or notch up the security in a way that it becomes unrealistic for a hacker or an attacker to actually bypass or try to bypass that. So I think we are already 5 minutes over. I'll also share the slides so that you can go over this material again. And one of the things that we are thinking at Attify is kind of building a community around hardware hacking and IoT hacking so that we can share ideas and help each other out in terms of questions. And if you have done something in terms of tear down, you can also post it there and other people can comment, and you can learn in a much faster way. And if you want to join that particular group, it's tinyurl.com/Attify Discord. And you can join over there and share your thoughts and ideas and anything that you're working on. So, yeah, happy to see what you guys are working on and see how this entire industry as an IoT security and hardware security can be advanced. And a special emphasis on if you're in university. So it's a great time to learn about these things because it will open a lot of different opportunities for you as you move into more and more professional levels of your life. So that is all for this webinar. I hope you had a great time. I hope you got to learn something and some of the things that you could possibly use immediately in your work or your activities in InfoSec.